Welcome to Southbank Centre's book podcast, where you'll hear us in conversation with the people shaping arts and culture today.
If you want to hear from some of the biggest and most influential names in contemporary literature, then you're in the right place. In this latest episode of the podcast, we're going to feature highlights from another great event in our 2019 autumn literature season for your listening pleasure.
Just to let you know, there may be some strong language and sexual references. Good evening, and welcome to Southbank Centre's Queen Elizabeth Hall. I am Debo Amon, Literature Programmer here at Southbank Centre, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Will Self, A Life in Writing. In Self's memoir, Will, we are taken on a funny, intense and anarchic journey into the mind of one of Britain's most daring and original writers. A funny, frenzied and honest memoir about his drug addiction in the 1980s and his attempts to grapple with adult life as he left university for the professional world. Chairing tonight's event is Alex Bilmes, Editor-in-Chief of Esquire, formerly features editor at British GQ and a contributing editor to British Vogue. Bilmes is a previous winner of the PPA Writer of the Year Award and the MJA Interviewer of the Year Award. Bilmes also edited Uncle Dysfunctional, a collection of A.A. Gill's columns, which was published in the UK and US by Canongate. Now, please join me in welcoming Will Self and Alex Bilmes.
I don't mean to start this conversation by saying something stupid right at the beginning, but this is a book about drugs, Will. It's a book about a drug addict, and it's also a book about a drug addict who clearly grew up steeped in the literature of drugs. And I was tickled to read at one point the character Will, I don't know if it's you as well, received a copy of The Naked Lunch as the English prize for in the lower sixth.
Yeah, at Christ College, Finchley, a really good grammar school. Yeah, it was my request. Actually, the reference in the first section that I kind of like, where he says, diconol and Ritalin in pill form. This is kind of guys that rob chemists' locked cabinets, and they'd always say diconol and Ritalin pill form, wet and dry amps of diamorphine, i.e. heroin, tunol capsules. Tunol, very big in the mid-70s, just as much mixed up in the kind of punk drug culture, heavy barbiturate as amphetamine. Mogadans and other benzos, tenuate DOSPAN spaniels, another weird artificial amphetamine. I don't think that's about anymore. This is like retro drugs. You sometimes get that. I remember they had an episode of Heartbeat in which they were like dealing black bombers. I was sort of saying to the kids, that's retro drugs, right? Because it's all usually about retro cars. They're all driving nice old Jaguars and dealing their retro drugs. And then it says uppers, downers, twisters and screamers, which I think is a line from Two-Lane Blacktop,
okay,
Monty Hellman film. And Warren Oates plays a character called GTO, who's a sort of insane, illegal race driver in the States, and he's got a kind of trunk full of drugs. And to say sort of steeped in drug culture, well, it wasn't just literary. The culture of the late 60s and 1970s, when I grew up, and probably quite a few people here grew up as well, was kind of steeped in a wider drug culture, a wider kind of love affair with the abandonment that drugs represented. Because, of course, very few people actually had direct experience of it. It had even more of a frisson.
The character in the book, it seems that to a certain extent he turns on to drugs because he's read about them in books.
Yeah, I think that the other sort of weird thing about the culture at that time, or the idea, what is a culture? It's a kind of vector that carries a set of practices, maybe artifacts, rituals, values through time. And the Will character says in the opening of the book, he's in some grotty squat in South London, scoring some drugs. It's 1986, and he sees lying in a sag bag a copy of this book written by Aleister Crowley, aka the Great Beast 666, this kind of weird kind of literary kind of hierophantic figure from the early 20th century. And he's very conscious of the fact, not just that he has been kind of reading at drugs about this kind of, drugs as representing some sort of avant-garde culture, but lots of other people around him have as well. And you would be in these squats in the 70s with junkies using drugs who had no real interest in a kind of wider literary culture, but they would talk about William Burroughs or Crowley, and they'd kind of know about them. They'd know. I remember people saying, because Burroughs had been living in London up until the late 70s, and I used to use drugs with people who'd used with Burroughs, and Alex Trockey, the Scots junkie writer who'd been living in Observatory Street in Kensington at that time. So it was around in the milieu, this sense of a culture in the full sense of the word, a set of practices that was being conveyed from generation to generation of drug users.
There's a line later in the book which says that the only peers pressuring him, are literary ones. And I'm curious as to whether or not you felt that that influence, was that a direct influence on you, on your decision to investigate
drugs? It just seemed obvious to me. It seemed obviously a career path. I mean, I sort of think, I'm used to ad hominem reviewing, and I'm used to reviews playing the man, not the ball. I've had it all my career. It's sort of my first book, which I published in '91, was, Cocteau said, Cocteau's line is, it was received with a terrifying baptism of caresses. I don't think I had a single negative review. My second book, Cock and Bull, published in 1992, received these savage reviews. Said I was a misogynist, I was an anti-Semite, I've always been kind of used to that to some extent, but I've been very surprised by how the memoir gives people kind of carte blanche to do that, to kind of play the man, not the ball, and to take, I specifically tried to construct the memoir in such a way as to make it clear that it's not really about me. And, and right at the heart of the conceit of writing the book is a kind of profound resistance to writing memoir as if it contains a moral arc and a moral story of any kind. And I think, I'm 58, but people have written memoirs younger, and 58 is in some senses getting younger. But, I'm old enough to really know that the guy who I was just, writing from within is not me. It's just quite clearly not me. And I wonder when people write memoir and say, I did this and I did that and I did that and now I think this about it and it seems to me that they're assuming that they have a perspective on their entire life, because you can't comment on what you were like at 10, 20, 30 in any depth or with any authority unless it's all over. In some important sense, you're standing outside of your life and you can comment on it in that way. So, to write a memoir is to write a biography of the living, and unless you're a sort of ghoul waiting for your own subject to die so that you can profit from it in some way, it's really not going to work. And the other problem, I think, that is hugely associated with memoir is kind of wanting to look good. And I think wanting to look good is one of the real besetting problems of our contemporary culture, which is very visually based. So, looking good is the operative word. And I think it comes in with memoir. Nietzsche says in the genealogy of morals, your memory says, you did that. Your pride says, I cannot have done that. And then pride and memory compete, and inevitably your pride wins. And I think if we're honest with ourselves and we really think about the more discreditable things we've done in life and the attitudes we've held and the ways we've behaved, and the extent to which we really, really honestly present those to other people, or even allow them much headspace in our lives. It's remarkably little, and it's very, very difficult to be objective about yourself at all, to be remotely objective about yourself. And you know, as long as I think on the page you retain that connection between the writing eye and the eye you're describing, then you're going to sugar the pill. Even if sugaring the pill consists in abasing yourself for the reader. So say, oh, look how dreadful I was, look how awful I was, oh, I was disgusting, oh, I was this most awful person. That's a form of vanity as well. So, you know, I perfectly understand that people would want to know.
Given all that, Will, given everything you just said, why did you write this book, and why did you write it now?
Well, I think I felt I really needed to sugar the pill for my publishers who have in danger of losing faith with the project. To some extent, I don't feel that it's not a. I mean, it sounds a bit odd, and I've read some of it to you. It sounds very odd to you, but in some ways, it's a bit of a jeu d'esprit. The novel, you know, the book. It's not. Don't intend you to take it too seriously.
It's fun.
Well,
in some ways, it is. It's funny.
The other thing I sort of wanted to do was a bit of a Künstlerroman, you know, a bit of a kind of explanation of where the fiction comes from. You know, why, you know, I remember years ago there used to be a feature in The Independent, some sort of Q&A feature where readers would ask you questions. And I think the first question when I did it was, why the long face, Will? and my reply was, because I have a long head. You know, and it's kind of... And it was a sort of to answer the question, why the long face, Will, in a sense, was to explain where a lot of it, and even down to the kind of modernist turn that my fiction's taken in the past 10 years, I wanted to kind of embed those kind of stylistic concerns and those kind of really philosophic concerns in my young life as well, so that was part of it. And I did see the memoir as a kind of, almost a kind of, you know, kind of resource for people who are a bit puzzled about the fiction. And, you know, I mean, I'm not being weird when I say that you know, the publishers might have been losing faith. I think it's, you know, I published Umbrella in 2011. I think, it was up for the Booker Prize that year and kind of lost by a short nose to Hilary Mantel, and that's all fine, and then published the other 2 volumes. It's been understandably hard to find readers, I think, and to feel that...
Why understandably?
We're living in an interesting age for culture. There he is saying that there is such a thing as a drug culture, but when we think about what a culture is, clearly there is, because, you know, older junkies would say to younger junkies, that's how you do this, and that's how you do that. And when we go to do this, and we don't talk about this, we use that vocabulary. And when you go over there, and you can hit on that doctor for a script, and you can go, you know. So there is a culture that is particular to those people, just as there's a culture particular to, you know, Han Chinese people. I mean, it's not... I think that weird things are happening with our culture at the moment, and I think that what strikes me is that a lot of what we're doing at the moment doesn't seem like a culture that is intent on transmitting its values, practices, even artifacts and rituals into the future. It feels like a culture with a great deal of anxiety about the future, about it. There's a problem with the avant-garde. You know, when I first went to Seattle in the early 90s, Kurt Cobain had been squatting very recently in the old fish market down by the port. And, you know, I met this guy called Jim Hogshire, who published a magazine called Pills A Go-Go, the Journal of Pills. And he had, in his apartment, he had quite a good loft apartment near the old fish market on the front of Seattle. And all over his apartment were bowls of different pills. Kind of, oh, those are amphetamines, and those are, you know, all these bowls of pills. And he had 3 clocks on the wall set to the times of different chemical disasters. So he had like Exxon Valdez time, Bhopal time, and Chernobyl time on the wall. And about sometime after midnight, he said, "I guess we're high enough now, let's get the guns out." And went to the closet and opened it up, and it was full of several racks of automatic weapons. I have to say that that's always the thing about America I've never really liked, as somebody that's enjoyed living on the somewhat seamier side of things, is that very quickly in America the guns come out. And that's not comfortable at all for those of us who grew up in the Hampstead Garden suburb. That's the point when you do feel that you've kind of crossed the line. But this long story has a point, this digression. When we left the apartment and went to get a coffee at a hip new coffee place called Starbucks. There is no avant-garde anymore. There's just fucking Starbucks, and you know that kind of that headline in The Onion, the American satirical mag. You know, new Starbucks opened in restroom of existing Starbucks. You know, and that's the contemporary avant-garde. It's a Starbucks opened in the toilet of an existing fucking Starbucks. You know, and a culture without an avant-garde is a culture with no tension. No creative tension between what the norm is, what good, solid family entertainment is, what people are allowed to say, and what people aren't allowed to say. You know, and there's, so in a way the avant-garde ate itself, it destroyed itself, it was bowdlerized, it was commercialized, and it shot itself in the foot through its own excesses. But nonetheless, it's one of the many canaries in the coal mine that tell you we're in deep doggy doos.
I'm going to bring you back to even cheerier to this book and to the 24-year-old standing on the Clapham Road with 57 pence in his pocket. He, right from the beginning, demonstrates a sort of sneering contempt for bourgeois culture. He's in the mid-1980s, and then the book jumps back to 1979. Throughout, it jumps forward and backwards, and throughout, the character of Will, even as a child,
displays a sneering
even
contempt
as a, I don't know how old were you, 3 when you ran away, when little Willie runs away from home and the nice lady offers to help him, and he thinks,
I think it's the 24-year-old Will who's adding the fucking grass there. There is
at different points there is a sneering contempt for bourgeois culture displayed. Where does that come from?
Well, the Hampstead Garden suburb.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to. English suburbia is a snake pit. I mean, didn't you grow up?
I did, yeah. I also have a sneering contempt for it, but
I think where does it come from, the sneering contempt? I mean, I would have to blame my mother, really. Mm-hmm. My mother found the English. She was American. She was born in 1922 in Columbus, Ohio, and my grandfather was a kind of, what you would call a huckster, if not indeed a shyster. You know, he was a peripatetic. You know, my mother told me that they survived in the Depression, a hard scrabbled childhood in the Depression, because my grandfather, he did the closing down sale when the department store in town was about to close. Grandpa Jack would go in, get all the stock together, sell it off. So they were like the vultures of this economic apocalypse. My mother's first husband, a man called Robert Adams, a rather eminent literary critic in the States, wrote a rather brilliant description of my grandfather and my mother's family. And he was from a kind of WASP family, and he was a Semophile, not an anti-Semite, but nonetheless his description of my grandfather is anti-Semitic in all but name. You know, that my grandfather, a bit like me, had a big nose, foul-mouthed, wisecracking, big cheap cigar, dirty jokes, I so identify. And a kind of profound cynicism about bourgeois culture, because that kind of comes from that immigrant side of not belonging. My mother grew up, my mother wouldn't talk about, I think the thing in the States, what she said was, the difference between America and Britain is that in America they hate you because you're black or because you're a woman or because you're a Jew. But in England, they hate you personally, and you only incidentally happen to be black or a woman or a Jew. And I think, she was like spot on, wasn't she? And I think she constantly felt that she was on the run from a society where, because remember, she grew up in a segregated society still for Jews as well as for African American people. So, and then she came to England where my father's father, was an anti-Semite. He'd written anti-Semitic stuff, and so, I think that gave me, I'm the child of a Jew and somebody who came from a portion of English society that was quite unconsciously anti-Semitic in the late 50s and 1960s. And I'm sorry, other people who are in this audience who of dual heritage will know what I'm talking about. It does leave you with a profound cynicism about certain societies that present themselves as English middle-class society does, and certainly did in the 60s and 70s, as being morally recondite by virtue of itself. We're the English middle class, so what we say goes. We read Bernard Levin in the Times, and we read Jill Tweedy in the Guardian, and we know, and we go to the festival hall, and fuck you,
Well, because we know so much about you, about your past, and about the role drugs played in your past, even before we read this book, we know quite a lot about it, or we think we do. It's always been the case that your books have been read through that prism. They've been reviewed through that idea, and it's thought that your style, your milieu, everything in it is informed in some way by drugs. Is that fair or unfair?
I think we are what we eat to some extent. We can't deny that. It's not so much the drugs. There's two aspects to it. One is, I think it's sort of our mutual friend Martin Amis wrote to me, said he was reading the memoir and sent me an email, and he said, it's a bit like youth is wasted on the young. He said, extraordinary that really only the young can afford a death wish that powerful. Obviously, once you get older, you have to address that, or you're not going to be alive. And it's sort of one of the problems for me is, and I didn't want to write a kind of, I used to be a teenage werewolf, but it's all right now. And I'm very skeptical of that kind of thing. I don't think it's helpful. I don't even think it's particularly compassionate. I don't think it necessarily works either as a piece of catharsis. And so I didn't want to present that thing that my kind of drug experience, the road to excess led to the Palace of Enlightenment in some way, because I don't think that's necessarily true. And for all of the reasons I said about writing memoir in general. But I do think that some of the ways in which drugs have made me are unexpected. If you face a lot of life-threatening situations, and really, that description at the end of the reading where the young man is injecting cocaine and has the syringe in his vein, so he's walking around with the cocaine solution in the barrel of the hypodermic, and he knows if he depresses the thing that he will die. And it's knowing that. And that kind of raw, confrontative business, it can't help but mark you. In some ways, if you get through it and you get past it, obviously you may say this is incredible bathos, but the defining moment of Dostoevsky's life, of course, was being sentenced to death for his peripheral involvement in a reading, a liberal reading circle. His brother, of course, had been in the Decembrist plot against the Tsar, and they were all taken up to be shot, and they were tied to the posts, And then the reprieve was granted. They're very Russian, that, isn't it? They're such a hoot, those Russians. Because that was like their standard gig. The Tsar loved to do that, to give because it was a sort of psycho game with the victims, because, of course, then they'd be hopelessly in love with the Tsar. And of course, Dostoevsky did exhibit that extraordinary conflict around authoritarian ideas. But, it's a bit like that. By the time I in fact went back, very unfortunately, to active addiction in my 30s and didn't finally get clean of hard drugs until my late 30s, which is not clever at all. So don't worry, there won't be a second volume. But, in a way, the worst had already happened. It had already happened. And if there's a certain levity in the book, it's that unavoidably it's written by somebody who is alive and is 58. In terms of the kind of raw fact, what do drugs do to you, man? What about Terence McKenna taking DMT and talking to other dimensions, and the whole Burroughs thing of kind of junk is not a kick, it's a way of life, and are drugs of addiction different to drugs of non-addiction, and and what about the hallucinogens as a big new interest? I reviewed that book by Michael Pollan, How to Change Your Mind, and that guy David Nutt, crazy name, crazy guy, has been sort of talking again about using hallucinogens for depression because the SSRIs aren't working anymore. And, in other words, just at a phenomenological level, does intoxication affect you creatively? I still feel the same about this. I've been asked about this question throughout my career, and I have to say, when all's said and done, I feel the same way about it, which is, taking acid. Ballard, my great friend and mentor, he took LSD once. He said that was more than enough. That was more than enough. He wrote about 9 books off the back of that one trip. Yeah? More than enough. I've probably taken LSD about 100 times, and what the other 99 times added is debatable. Yeah? So I think I feel the same way about it. I think certain kinds of drugs in certain kinds of contexts can be absolutely fascinating and be quite stimulating and interesting. So can spinning round and round until you feel really dizzy and falling over. So can talking to random strangers. So can, breathing very fast. I think what's more interesting to me is in a way what cultures make of drugs and how, what it is. And I think that on the whole, it's not gone well.
Yeah, you write in the book about the again and again, the round and round of the drug addict's experience, the sort of high, the addiction, and then the withdrawal. And you also say in this book that it's boring. But it's not boring because you've written so well about it. And you've written about it, others have written about it. People who've never experienced it find it fascinating. Why?
Okay, there's several questions there at once. I think
the
a perennial thing is, yes, the wine that is bedevil. I think there's drug pornography. I've always said that. I think there's a pornographic element, and people who would never dream of doing hard drugs or doing them in a kind of weird, hard way do get a weird little kick out of it, just as they enjoy looking at videos on the internet of several people having sex with a donkey. They would never do it. They know the donkey didn't consent. But nonetheless, late at night, when the word donkey and the word coitus pop into their mind simultaneously.
I'm not sure many people enter coitus into into their search engines.
You get very different things if you put donkey coitus.
Really?
You get a whole swathe of medicalized donkey pornography.
Good to know.
Why is that good to know? But that's the thing about the web, isn't it? It's out there, right? And the other thing is, it was kind of interesting as a phenomenon, as a sociological phenomenon, and if you're kind of metacritical about it, and I've spoken to my peers, I'm not alone in this. We were a very drug addicted generation, And they have the same feeling about it. I'm not alone in this, that, we were the first generation who read William Burroughs' Junkie and then became junkies.
Yeah.
And it wasn't because, we'd read William Burroughs' Junkie that we became junkies, but it happened to be that way round. So it inevitably made us a more self-referential and kind of culturally self-conscious generation in that way. That was the whole impact of the 60s experience. And so I think all of that is interesting. I think the way in which drugs, because they're illegal, they thrust you into criminal subcultures. And unfortunately, they are interesting in the way any avant-garde are interesting. They're interesting in a kind of Crowley-esque way, in a do what thou wilt is the whole of the law way, because they represent a kind of pure existential freedom in that sense. So I think that that's interesting. And drugs, of course, are interesting, just like anybody who tells, where would your life be, frankly, for whole swathes of it if you couldn't tell stories about the silly things people do when they're pissed?
Yeah.
I mean, it would actually, kind of anecdotage and conversation generally among the human species, certainly the human species, say, under 40, would just die altogether. Nobody would have anything to say to each other. So at that level, there's just a certain kind of slapstick humor that's always associated with intoxication.
Yeah.
You put that together with somebody who wants to write and really wants to write something that's interesting and readable, then unavoidably it comes up as a bit interesting. And then I think with the memoir, what you throw in is geographicals as well, which we haven't talked about, which is this thing of kind of going to a foreign country and going really as far away as you can to get off the drugs, means that you inevitably end up in some kind of weird, far-flung places. Usually with a lot of other people who've chipped up there because they're trying to give up drugs as well.
And Will, you chose to, in the book, you choose to go to dry out in a country where the ready availability of heroin couldn't have been more.
Yes, I ended up on one of my geographicals in Kashmir at that time, still open to travellers, where I think heroin was $2 US a gram at the time. Quite cheap. That was not a very successful geographical.
You do have a lot of fun in the book with all of that, as you just said. But there's also, particularly at the end, there's a very moving passage, which is sobering, I suppose, passage, where you describe a young man who was your friend who died because...
Probably drugs were certainly implicated, and he'd been the most charismatic of our group at university. He was a bit older, came from way more bohemian background than me, and through him I kind of met a lot of kind of old bohemia in London at the same time. And he died in 1985 at the age of 26 or 27. I'm actually starting to tear up a bit now talking about it, because I do find it very moving, and I thought about it as I was getting towards the end of the memoir, because it coincided with the period that he died. And I thought, I've thought about him every week. And of course, who am I to him? He's so alive, this young man. He's so alive and has been alive in his 26ness in me. And in a way, he feels more vivid to me than I do, actually. And it's something about, that's the kind of alchemy that as a writer I'm trying to produce, that kind of strange, uncanny, haunted sense that hopefully when you put a book down, your own life feels a little bit more flat and unreal compared to the vividness of the creations that you've met between the covers.
You have the ability to raise the dead.
It's surely the compensation and the role that culture has always played for societies is to do that. And what I think worries a lot of us at the moment is that our culture, with its incredibly short attention span and its rampant narcissism, may no longer be fit for that purpose.
I didn't intend it to end on that note, but we are out of time, and it seems like an okay note to end on. I don't know how you feel about that, Will.
Well, I mean, it's a flat note.
Thank you very much, Will.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's it for this episode. Make sure you subscribe to the Southbank Centre Books podcast in all the usual places.
For more information about upcoming events, go to southbankcentre.co.uk or look us up on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram.